The world operates on the rails of incentive. All human behavior can be studied and understood through the lens of incentive. What behavior a system promotes and supports, or discourages and shames, is how societies are structured. The reason people act and think the way that they do is not random. They are subject to the influences of the incentive structures they exist within, and the more clearly you see the threads of incentive, the more adept you become at navigating the world and spinning your own threads. To be aware of the incentives that influence you is to have control over the outcomes of your life. The greater your awareness, the greater your agency, and the greater your ability to exercise freedom and promote it for others who have not yet achieved that awareness. The failure to understand how the world at large wishes you and others to behave is nearly a guarantee that you will be subject to the will of those who design and craft the systems and the incentives contained within them. I'm Yevgeny Nurish, and this is the River of Incentive. I've established that I believe global inflation as a result of fiat monetary supply expansion to be the single largest problem facing the world. It breaks our fundamental understanding of what things are worth today and what they'll be worth in the future, making it impossible to make accurate determinations about where capital and resources should be allocated for the continued progress and even potentially existence of our species. People starve, go without power, are killed, and wage war, both directly and indirectly as a result of inflation. To understand inflation, we must understand the incentives that cause it, and subsequently, the incentives inflation produces. This is critical to understanding not just how the economy works, but how the entire world works. Incentives are neither evil nor good, but the behaviors they encourage can be. For this reason, we should seek to live in a world where the incentives guide us towards progress and success for as many as possible and promote human flourishing. While nearly all of the following holds true for the world at large, I'll be using the United States specifically as the basis for most of what we discuss. For the remainder of this video, imagine that the U.S. is a civilization built on a riverbank, with its citizens stratified by their position relative to the source of the river. Those with the most water will thrive, while the volume of water dwindles and life becomes muddier downstream. The groups impacted by inflationary incentives are most easily categorized and understood by their proximity to the source, that is, the issuers of money. Group 1. Headwater. For those closest to the source, the primary incentive is obvious. Stay as close to the source as possible. The source of money is where power is most highly concentrated, and those with power seldom relinquish it voluntarily. We already know that in addition to the power to create money, the Federal Reserve has levers like interest rate controls that they can use to manipulate demand for goods and currencies by making the rate of lending more or less expensive, which in turn influences the rate of economic expansion and contraction. What's more interesting than power itself is the perverse incentives created by the entire Western system of democracy when it comes to the pursuit of power. Other than the president, no elected officials at the highest level of the U.S. government have a limit to the number of terms they can serve. The only thing that changes is the duration of those terms. This means that every 2, 4, and 6 years, for the House, Presidency, and Senate respectively, there is an opportunity for a massive power grab. Keeping in mind the proximity to the source is the closest analog to direct political power, what inevitably results is a ferocious melee between politicians to hold on to that power by any means necessary. What emergent patterns of behavior and thought does this incentivize? Most importantly, it encourages our elected officials to think only 2, 4, and 6 years into the future. The process of changing a country is a slow, decades-long endeavor if things take their natural course. In order to keep getting elected, politicians must accelerate their way towards whatever change they can enact in these relatively short term lengths. What is the solution to the problem of accomplishing any meaningful goal at the level of national policy in 2 to 6 years? The answer is you must throw as much money as you can at the problem. This is why government spending is so grossly inefficient and why there is so much wasteful and wasted money in politics. They must spend millions of dollars on campaigns to get elected, most of which is provided by special interest groups. Then they must do whatever those special interest groups tell them to as quickly as possible in order to maintain their support, remain in power, and enact the goals that are meaningful to them. They don't have time to source the best contractors at the best prices, or to deeply analyze the second and third order impact of their decisions, nor do they care. All that matters is get elected, spend as much as they can to have something to show for it, campaign for re-election, rinse and repeat. This is also why politics almost necessarily becomes more partisan and divisive over time. While everyone should ostensibly be on the same team, in that we all want what is best and most prosperous for our country and her people, because politicians must curry strong favor, they can't afford to have lukewarm positions. The average person is apolitical or tends towards centrism, but over time, as the desires of special interest groups become more specific, politics becomes more radical. This is why we have so few honorable politicians that maintain their positions. The most reasonable, rational politicians with the best intentions, that is, those that are the least corruptible, cannot survive in this system, because they can't maintain the financial support of the lobbyists and special interest groups, and they can't finance their own campaigns. To survive, you must play the game, and the incentives of the game are corrupting and tend towards extremes over time by their very nature. It's important to understand that the incentive structure that leads to such short-sighted thinking is why we have so many policies under consideration that seem trivial and irrelevant at best, or patently ridiculous on average. The value of our money is being halved every 10 years. We just spent 2 years in a state of government-funded panic over a global pandemic, and nobody under 50 can afford housing. But if you pay attention to the mainstream media or political discourse, you would assume that the most important policy issue of our generation is which pronouns people prefer. When the time horizon of the people who run the country is as short as 2 years, you're going to see a lot of decisions that only look out that far. Personally, I don't think people are going to care as much about pronouns when we're in a multi-year global recession because our policymakers promoted short-sighted inflationary policy for things that nobody will need or even remember 10 years from now. The second and less intuitive element of all of this is the relationship between inflation and debt. I've said that the foundation of the global economy is mountainous debt and a guarantee of perpetual credit expansion. But what does that really mean, and why is that the case? Since virtually the entire world has switched to a fiat central banking system, currencies are not backed by assets. Money is simply issued at will by central banks, and governments and markets have a twisted symbiosis that establishes monetary value relative to the things that those currencies can purchase. However, if all fiat money is unbacked garbage, why is it that some currencies, like the US dollar, are stronger and more universally desirable than others, like the yen? Even the most naive of economists and the most ignorant of politicians understands that they can't just print monopoly money and hope nobody calls them out on it, although that isn't too far off from the truth. Instead, when the government needs to fund new projects, it issues bonds and treasury bills. Both are forms of U.S. debt that anyone can purchase and which provide very modest but very low-risk returns. In the simplest terms, a bond is a loan the purchaser of the bond gives to the government that pays a small amount of interest on a fixed schedule over a period of up to 30 years. Treasury bills, or T-bills, are functionally an IOU from the government, to be paid within a period not exceeding a year. They don't pay interest, but they can be purchased at a discount. So, for instance, you could purchase a $1,000 T-bill for $950, and when the T-bill matures, it can be redeemed for the full $1,000 face value. The reason any given currency is strong, weak, desirable, or undesirable in comparison to any other currency is an entire field of economic study and can't be holistically described in short-form audio content. But as a rule of thumb, the stronger a country's economy is, the lower their default risk, or the chance of them not being able to pay their debt. The lower the default risk, the more valuable their debt, and the more valuable their currency. U.S. bonds are considered a safe haven investment, and globally, the bond market is sort of the baseline tool investors use as a measuring stick for returns. So, in relative terms, we have the strongest currency and very desirable bonds, so both the U.S. debt and the U.S. dollar enjoy high demand. That's good for us, but what's the catch? I should explain how money actually gets made. When the government wants more money to fund something, the Fed and the Treasury don't always just print physical bills, although that does occur. Instead, we finance our debt through a process called debt monetization. If I owe Jim $100, I don't have the ability to write $100 on a rectangular piece of paper and give it to Jim to service that debt. But if the U.S. owes $31 trillion to itself and to its citizens, which it does, it can simply borrow money from the Federal Reserve to make payments on that debt, while simultaneously devaluing that debt by inflating the supply of the money it uses to pay the debt with. This is debt monetization. So, if the debt is too large, the government can simply print more money or buy its own bonds, which reduces the cost of the debt in real terms, while they pay down the debt in nominal terms, with the loan they gave themselves. That's the catch. Since the US government can pay its debts in its own currency, they have very little incentive to limit spending. Our economic strength today enables us to make reckless decisions that cripple us tomorrow, because if we need more money, we can just borrow it from ourselves. If this doesn't make any sense to you, it's because it doesn't make any sense in reality either, and history has shown many times that it doesn't work forever. This is the 1000th iteration of this experimental debt model in the history of mankind, and our leaders have the hubris to think that the last 999 empires that collapsed did so because they didn't have the technology or the sophistication to make it work, rather than understanding and recognizing the fundamental unsustainability of a global economy built on self-issued IOUs. It's a miracle that the system has been working for this long, and working is a generous term. Our methods of attempting to control the economy are barbaric at best, and if you pay attention, you'll see the frequency and severity of high-impact economic events increases year after year, growing ever more volatile. Meanwhile, the return on bonds and T-bills does not even come close to beating the rate of inflation, meaning that you now lose money by holding them each year, even though they offer so-called risk-free return. This is dramatically reducing the demand for the purchase of government debt, the thing upon which money itself is based. This begs two questions. The first is, what is the incentive to purchase and hold a T-bill or bond? And at the moment, there really isn't one, which is why the government is the largest purchaser of its own debt, owning just over $12 trillion worth of bonds. Yes, you heard that correctly. The government owns more of its own debt than any other organization, country, or individual, meaning there's even less incentive to exercise any degree of fiscal or monetary responsibility, because who cares about a debt you owe yourself? This isn't just the case in the US either. It's actually the case for nearly every country with a fiat currency. In Japan, the Japanese government holds more than 50% of its own bonds. If the risk-free rate on bonds continues to fail to beat the rate of inflation, demand for them will continue to crumble, forcing governments to deal with the short-term pain associated with fiscal responsibility, or, much more likely, continue issuing itself loans, weakening our currencies even more. This is an incentive death spiral. The second question is, aren't there controls in place to cap the debt or prevent us from issuing ourselves endless loans and destroying the strength of our own currency, both domestically and globally? The answer is technically yes. We have what is called a debt ceiling, a federal cap on the amount of debt our government is allowed to incur. However, as you may have guessed, the debt ceiling doesn't mean anything at all. We've raised the debt ceiling 78 times since it was formalized in law in 1917. In fact, there has literally never been a time when Congress did not approve the raising of the debt ceiling, and it has never been lowered, meaning that functionally, there isn't one. To paint the clearest picture possible, imagine that you are living in a one-story house that is rapidly flooding to the top with raw sewage, where sewage represents debt. Your first instinct would likely to be to try to identify the source of the sewage pumping into your home so that you could attempt to shut it off. Failing that, you'd call a plumber and grab some buckets to start dumping the waste outside, trying to preserve whatever you can while you wait for the plumber to arrive. While the process would be uncomfortable, sticky, and disgusting, eventually you would be able to clear out the sewage and restore your home to its previous state and move on. However, the US government's instinct when confronted with the same problem would be to call the plumber and do nothing while they wait for the plumber to get there. When the plumber arrives, they would ignore his advice, pay him triple his rate, and tell him to leave. Then they would assemble all of Congress and vote on the solution, to raise the roof of the house. They would continue this process until the house implodes under the weight of built-up wastewater, showering their neighbors with their excrement. They would then finance a campaign to hide the fact that the source of the sewage was actually them all along. Then they would blame the plumber. To recap, the incentives of those closest in proximity to the source of money are to A. Maintain that proximity at any cost, B. Spend as much as possible, as quickly as possible, on the satisfaction of their supporters, C. Continue to increase leverage in the system by issuing government debt backed by other debt, D. Purchase that debt when there's low external demand for the debt, and E. pay down the debt by giving the government loans issued by itself to itself in order to keep the system alive. It's easy to see that the incentives of the current system only align with those in power, and even then, they don't even align particularly well. The politicians who participate are rarely able to accomplish what they set out to when they entered politics, and instead begin to act in the pursuit of power as an end, rather than a means to ends that benefit their constituents. Money backed by debt and force, rather than assets and energy, cannot last forever. Perpetual motion machines do not exist in physics, and they don't exist in economics either. The incentives are broken, and eventually the system will break as well. Keep in mind that breaking doesn't mean that everyone's going to die or the government and our identity as a nation-state is going to collapse and disappear overnight. There are hundreds of examples of what a financial breakdown looks like in recent history. The most potent example that comes to mind would be the hyperinflationary environment of the Weimar Republic during World War I. In 1921, the German government took the German mark off the gold standard and began financing the war with debt. By 1923, $1 was worth 4,210,500,000,000 German marks. Germany was economically crushed, which set the stage perfectly for a disastrous political sea change. Exactly 10 years later, in 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power, and we all know what happened after that. Group 2. Tributaries. Now that we have a better understanding of the principles of inflationary incentive at the source, it's time to look downstream. If the source of inflationary incentives are the central banks and federal governments, the next in line would be the commercial banks, the Wells Fargos and JP Morgans of the world. While they still don't have access directly to the source of money, and they can only influence policy indirectly, they still possess a great deal of power to create incentives and shape the world for those more distant from the headwater. This group's primary role in the economy is to act as a distribution network for money. Since people don't typically get loans or take money directly from the Fed, these banks act as a sort of economic buffer, purchasing money either in the form of government debt or cash, and in turn providing commercial and personal loans to those that bank with them. The economic incentive is for banks to issue as many loans as possible, since interest payments on those loans are one of commercial banks' only revenue streams. Most people can't afford to purchase big-ticket items like cars or houses lump sum with cash, so they take out loans. Mortgages, auto loans, personal loans. The more money you borrow, the more banks make. This is counterintuitive, though. If loans are how banks make money, how do they have the money to lend in the first place? Customer deposits, of course. That's right. When you put your money in a bank, you give them license to use your funds to loan out and generate interest on. This is why banks offer interest for depositing your funds, to incentivize you to provide them with capital to loan out. Of course, usually the interest rate on your deposit is about 0.25%, whereas the rate on the loans they issue are typically a multiple of whatever the Fed interest rate is, currently 4.25 to 4.5%. That's because the Fed interest rate is the rate at which banks borrow money from the government, which means they have to charge more interest on whatever loans they hand out. So, the government borrows from itself, the banks borrow from the Fed, and we borrow from the banks. The money we store in those banks isn't actually there. It's largely being lent out to other people. And what money there is in the banks is fractionally reserved. A small bank may hold millions in customer deposits, but only have $50,000 to $200,000 in cash and assets on site. In other words, money and credit are almost indistinguishable from each other in the current system. What incentives does this create for commercial banks? Since an overwhelming majority of bank revenue comes from interest, it incentivizes banks to encourage their depositors to take out frivolous loans and promote wasteful consumer behavior. Over time, it incentivizes the banks to give out loans to increasingly suspect parties who are very obviously unable to make the interest payments on those loans, which, as we saw in 2008, subsequently collapsed the entire U.S. housing market and devastated the global economy. It also creates a perverse incentive to issue predatory loans at exorbitant interest rates to individuals with bad credit, making it difficult for them to participate in the economy and creating a world where the default expectation is that we will own nothing and be indebted forever. Medical debt, credit card debt, housing debt, student debt, car debt. While government debt absolutely dwarfs all other kinds of debt, commercial and personal loans are a substantial part of the inflationary incentive equation. It's debt, all the way down, and the incentive structure is for it to stay that way until the system implodes. Because just as the US devalues its debt in real terms by creating more debt and monetizing it, the real value of consumer debt shrinks as the money supply inflates as well. Except consumers see that inflation occur with a delay, meaning that we get hit much harder than the government, since we can't print money and wage inflation occurs much more slowly than price inflation. So, we earn less and things cost more, and the inverse is mathematically impossible to ever be the case. The less you can purchase and own, the more the government gets to pretend inflation isn't a problem, since demand is reduced by merit of nobody being able to afford goods. And so, while the commercial bank's job is to distribute resources from the source downstream, their core incentive is to grab and hold as much as they can. Group 3. Channels. This is where I, and likely you, sit in the hierarchy. We are the largest segment of the river, the part that dominates the landscape around us with what flow remains from the source. We labor, we build businesses, and we contain most of the life and economic potential in the world by far. However, our ability to create incentives for other parts of the river is limited, since we don't control nearly as much of the flow. Because of this, it appears our lives are shaped and structured, and our incentives are decided by those at the headwater and tributaries. This doesn't have to be the case. We may have less power, but unintuitively, we have many more choices, because our judgment is not clouded by our proximity to the source. We are capable of seeing another way. We have enough money to live, and in some cases, thrive. But because we don't have easy access to unlimited money, we see that there may be more to the world than fake money and fake power. We can create our own incentives and make our own choices, which means our lives are both more difficult and our paths less clear than those upstream. It seems then that our greatest incentive ought to be to take advantage of this optionality. In other words, to optimize for freedom. For some, freedom is the pursuit of power, to march upstream and try to harness the river for their own gain. For some, it could mean leaving the river to search for a different water source, one not corrupted by the incentives those at the headwater create to maintain their position in the hierarchy. And for some, it means leaving the system and its values altogether. The channel isn't such a bad place, and while it's human nature to strive for more, there is an entire world of rivers, lakes, and oases to strike out and search for. Wealth is not only found upstream. No matter what path we choose, we should not allow ourselves to live on the rails of incentives created by others, even when we perceive them to be above us in the hierarchy. We must not conflate proximity to the source with wisdom and rightness. That said, we have the disadvantage of being dangerously close to the mouth, where the river begins to run dry, a fate we must avoid at all costs. Group 4. Mouth. Here, you have nothing. You have no economic identity. This is where the homeless, the starving, the politically and economically abused gather, to die of thirst. What is the incentive here? To do whatever you can, by any means necessary, to fight for survival and get back upstream. The incentive is to lie, cheat, and steal from those nearest to you. The incentive is to take whatever meager motes of life those further up in the river deign to give you and beg for more. Otherwise, you are invisible, or, at best, an afterthought. There is no incentive to get here, but, oddly enough, those at the source do provide incentives to stay here. They will occasionally try to send aid, but the money is muddied and diluted by the time it reaches you. They don't know how to help you, or deal with you. They make it legal for you to steal. Not from them or the banks, mind you, but from the residents of the channels. The best they can do is to put you in a concrete cell for a night, or make it legal to overdose on fentanyl, so you aren't their problem anymore. Those at the headwater are building dams at the source to contain the water and concentrate it at the top of the river. This is not a condemnation. The impulse is understandable. To have much is to want more, and when all you've seen and been taught is that money is power, and power is the ultimate end, it's virtually impossible to unlearn. However, the more dams they build, the drier the riverbed gets, and as it dries up, so too do the options for those at the mouth. Throughout history, we have built the same civilization with the same dams over the same rivers, over and over and over again. And throughout history, the story ends one of three ways. Sometimes, as the channel shrinks, those running out of water begin to revolt against those upstream. If the revolt is successful, they become the new controller of the source, only to rebuild the dams for themselves and start the process anew. Sometimes an outside civilization arrives and takes the river by force, seizing the source for themselves. Given just how much physical power those at the source have this time around, and the insidiousness and subtlety of the incentives they have created, uprising or conflict is unlikely to be how this particular chapter of the river civilization ends. This leads us to the third ending. Sometimes, for all their craftiness, the dams they build to contain economic power and authority are weak, and when the dams break and the river floods, everyone drowns. Near the end of the Zimbabwean hyperinflationary crisis, a loaf of bread cost roughly 10 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. When there is too much money and not enough real value, currency becomes worthless, and the civilization crumbles until the survivors rebuild. However, for the first time in history, we have the opportunity to write a new ending. Away from the river, towards the oasis. Once you understand the inherent and irreparable perverseness of the incentives created by the central bankers and political structures of the world as it is, there is one incentive that practically screams at you with its obviousness: to escape it. However, until very recently, the only way to survive outside the river you were born near is to pack up and move to another river in another country. The river, for all its faults, gives life. Civilization is a good thing, a thing that makes life better for our species, and while it's essential to recognize that it can and should be better, the incentive has to exist for it to do so. Following the metaphor, leaving the river and walking into the desert is risky, and survival is uncertain. There are almost 2 billion people in the world today who are unbanked, who have no access to the river at all, and who are much worse off than us. Having our money stolen from us via taxation and inflation is still immeasurably better than having no money at all. Still, it is inarguably unwise to put our lives in the hands of a system so obviously riddled with malincentives, and so obviously unaligned with the interests of most of the parties participating in it. How is it sensible that a bureaucrat from New York City makes decisions about what's best for a farmer in Nebraska, or that an 80-year-old man from Pennsylvania is expected to equally service the needs of both, in addition to 330 million other people spread across 4 million square miles of territory? No rational person would assume that such a system can work, and yet we accept it as such without question. Let's return to the river metaphor one last time, this time from an engineering perspective. There is too much water, that is, too much money, in the world. Central banks and governments are doing their best to build giant dams and concentrate that money in one place in an attempt to control the flow, while simultaneously and perpetually pumping more water in. As the pressure rises, they continue to refuse to relieve it, either because they don't see the problem or because they're afraid of relinquishing control. Their hands are few, and as cracks appear, their solution is to plug the holes with their fingers, assuming they notice the cracks at all. The collapse of the dam is seemingly inevitable. We know that the incentives of this system create an environment where most governments are too short-sighted, too distracted by nonsense, or care too little about the eventual impact this type of monetary policy to change course, even if it spells their own end. However, what if there were a way to release this economic pressure without having to control the source? One that gives equal control to everyone. What if there were an oasis, or, more accurately, a vessel that could contain any amount of water, and every person on Earth had a siphon that could extract water from the reservoir into that vessel? It's tempting to do a full reenactment of the milkshake scene from There Will Be Blood, but that's effectively what we're talking about. Each person with a giant straw, reaching into the milkshake that is the global monetary supply. Furthermore, they could access that vessel anytime and from any place, almost as though they were teleporting to it, or carrying it with them always. The whole world would have access to life-giving water, while simultaneously relieving the enormous pressure that the governments of the world have created behind the dam. This all sounds like science fiction, but that's precisely what Bitcoin serves as, a monetary vessel, accessible to anyone in the world and at any time. As more and more people recognize the instability inherent to the current system, they will refuse to have their life savings be subject to the choices of a government increasingly in denial about its mishandling of the world's economy. The incentive is very strong to look for a source of water outside of that system, but even more accessible. and they will find that there is only one: Bitcoin. Bitcoin creates a harmonious alignment of incentives for every denizen of the river, with the exception of the truly evil, who wish only to hold power over others for power's sake. As demand for Bitcoin increases, demand for non-scarce assets and fiat currencies will decrease. While this reduces the amount of power governments and banks have over their citizens and customers, it's actually net good for them in the long run. As demand for fiat currencies decrease, so too does the inflationary pressure on governments to create new money via the issuance of debt to artificially prop up economic growth. This allows the fiat monetary system to breathe, contract, and extend its lifespan naturally and with more rational incentives, while simultaneously reducing the risk of economic and political instability and localized collapses. There could be a Bitcoin economy, one that is separate from, but one that undergirds and coexists with the traditional economy, without being subject to the whims of its policymakers and enforcers. The Bitcoin economy has no dams and no roadblocks, with rights and access granted equally and globally. Again, we come back to incentives. No matter how good-hearted and compassionate we all wish to be, ultimately, there must be an incentive for most humans to behave altruistically. That is, there must be something in it for them. Bitcoin creates powerful economic incentives, which all lead down the road of human prosperity. Bitcoin incentivizes economic compassion. It easily reaches the unbanked, enabling billions of additional productive participants in the global economy and empowering them to interact with and conduct business with each and every other user of the Bitcoin network, anywhere in the world. Bitcoin incentivizes governments to behave more rationally and responsibly, since it provides every person on the face of the earth with a tool to convert the debt-backed IOUs they call currency into a harder, sounder money than has ever existed before. Bitcoin incentivizes the creation of energy grid infrastructure in places in the world where it is otherwise prohibitively expensive or unwieldy to build. Because Bitcoin provides an economic incentive to find and produce the cheapest energy possible, Bitcoiners are building hydroelectric dams, solar, and wind farms in towns and villages that have never had access to electricity before, in places like rural Africa, planting the roots of modern civilization in places that are otherwise cut off from these resources. Bitcoin incentivizes you to be skeptical of those who craft the incentives that shape the behavior of the world, and in turn, to think deeply about the role they play in shaping you. I could go on for another 6,000 words about all the incredible things that Bitcoin creates strong economic incentives for, but I think it's best that you do your own research and find out what Bitcoin means to you personally. Because, in my humble opinion, one of the greatest things about Bitcoin is that it incentivizes everyone who learns about it to zoom out and understand the incentive structure of the entire world. It incentivizes you to understand why the money we use today is broken, and it forces you to question why we have simply taken that as a given for the entire history of fiat currency. It incentivizes you to understand global energy production, how miners utilize stranded energy that would otherwise be wasted, while also promoting the global production of renewable energy sources and providing the best outlet yet for excess energy from those sources. It incentivizes you to look at the huge untapped potential of the human race as a whole, and it unlocks 1/6 of the global population, dramatically increasing the size of the talent pool of economic participants. Finally, Bitcoin incentivizes you to look much deeper and further into the future for yourself, the people you love, and the world at large. If we continue down the path of excess and consumption, of buying things we can't afford, with money that is itself indistinguishable and inseparable from debt and credit, what good can come of it? If we fail to invest in the future, what good will that future be? Why can't I see past the things I want today in order to be a better person tomorrow? Don't allow yourself to be cast adrift on the river of incentive, guided by hands you cannot see, and which do not know what is best for you, your family, or your country. Bitcoin empowers and enables you to command your own destiny and to truly see how far you can go. Thank you for listening.
You're scared of a world where you're needed, so you never made nice with the locals, but you tied